get started, I just want to go ahead and thank Zoe, of course, for her work and for being with us. And she's always just a wonderful resource and a wonderful support for us as we do these webinars. And I want to welcome all of you to the Consciously Secure Parent 2 webinar for creating safe spaces offline and online. This is a webinar that came about initially, this webinar now really series, which initially came about because I was talking to a parent who was a bit frustrated at the fact that her son, who was in a robotics class, had to use a particular application which required their home computer to turn off their security settings. And so she posted about it on Facebook, and she was a bit frustrated. So I responded. We started talking, and she mentioned too that her husband did not support this idea. It wasn't something that they wanted to do, and I told her definitely that she shouldn't do it. You know, and a larger piece of this conversation is: do we sacrifice privacy and security and this process of working from home or homeschooling our children? And the response to that is no. And so this really opened up a lot of other questions and challenges that I realized parents were going through, whether it was just the challenge of thinking about how best to spend your time when you're at home working, but also following up on your children and ensuring that they're doing all the things that they have to do. And depending on how old they are, you know, you still have to get all of their Zoom meetings set up for them because they can't do it by themselves. And you have to ensure that they're following up on their homework because it's easy for them to get distracted, and there's just so much going on. And so that led to the Consciously Secure webinar, and many of you guys were on that with us with Shanghai Hammond, and it was a really amazing and fascinating talk. And so one of the things that I just want to do is just recap a couple of the pieces that came out of that talk, and really what then led to where we are now with having this second discussion. And one of the first things that came out of it was this question around, do we sacrifice security and privacy for this quick shift that we had to make? And again, the answer to that is no. Just because we have to move quickly, companies have to move quickly to get their coworkers and their employees set up online, remotely, and because schools have to do the same thing, we don't have to sacrifice security for that or sacrifice privacy. So if there's a tool that as a parent that you're being asked to use by the school, and you have to disable your security or privacy settings in order to use that tool, then that should be a red flag to bring that up to an administrator, because at the end of the day, they should be able to offer you another resource. And if they can't, then that's one of the challenges that's happening right now for a lot of parents. But there still has to be a conversation. And we can talk about that more later. Other things that came up that we discussed were Zoom. At that time, a couple of weeks ago, Zoom was heavy in the news as we were talking about Zoom bombing and the fact that whether it was a bot that was coming in and taking kind of control or taking over a meeting, or whether it was teenagers or whether it was people just being disruptive, how best to mitigate and manage that. And so what we've talked about is that that's a really big thing right now for education and for schools, and for them to try and manage that. So part of that is probably because they have public links that they're continuing to share, and they still have not made a point to implement the security settings or follow up and ensure that the security settings are being utilized in the right way. So that has been a challenge. And then the other thing that came up is the challenge that that continues to come up around how do we best protect our children? Do we set parental controls, or do we talk to them? And I think the answer is both. But we'll talk about that a bit more later on in the webinar. But it's something that came up in the last webinar. We just didn't have the time to really dive deep, which is part of the reason why this led to a number 2. So the second webinar in the series, and then the other things that we talked about were just really how overwhelmed teachers were at this time a couple of weeks ago, and how they still are very overwhelmed, but also how overwhelmed parents are. That this is a challenging time, and at the end of the day, we don't want anyone to feel like they're failing, for teachers, if they're homeschooling their children and homeschooling the children in their classroom, it's completely overwhelming. And it doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter if you're inner city school, if you're out in the Midwest, if you have children in public school, private school, whatever that is. The challenges, many of the challenges are the same, yet many of the challenges are different. And so we'll talk more about that on the call today. We'll also dive deeper into also the challenges that maybe young children have and that they could be facing that may be different from some of the older children. And we didn't get a chance to dive deep on that in the last webinar either. So coming out of the Consciously Secure Parent webinar, I had the opportunity to meet Terris, who is just an incredible visionary and leader in the education space. And I have to say, Terris, probably one of the things that just completely that I really loved about our first conversation was when you really talked about your vision and how you really see education changing in the future. That in the future, and it's closer than we think, that do we really need these structures of schools? And how can we take buildings that are around the country that maybe aren't being utilized during the day? And that is where we have our new schools. Those are the safe physical spaces where people can go and have online classes where they can feel safe online and offline and probably get a more engaged and better education that makes them more competitive, not just in the United States, but in the world. And so, I think the way we have seen education traditionally in this country will change completely. And so I look forward to us talking about that as well. But I would just love for you to introduce yourself and talk a bit about who you are and your background and experience.
Jessica, thank you for having me. I really am for a teacher and people that work, and during our cyberspaces, we have to connect. And so I'm glad that we're going to have this conversation. Again, I'm Terris King. I'm a kindergarten teacher at Shanghai American School in Shanghai, China, and have been forced here to my home, my childhood home. I'm here with my family. This shirt is a little tight because I've been eating a lot of my mom's cooking the last few months. And I'm also the founder and CEO of Home to School. And we work with young families in Shanghai. And when I arrived there, I was blown away by the dedication of the families in China and the families that I was working with. There was a lot of passion around supplemental education and just doing as much as possible outside of school to make sure that children were growing and learning and competing. But I also noticed that a lot of the things, at least for me, that I felt was developmentally inappropriate based off of research, a lot of it being children on screens for hours a day, engaging with maybe people here in the States to learn different, engage. That was happening. So we've been working a lot with families to just guide them through some of the things that they can do in their home spaces to just encourage learning in a more authentic way. And it's been so much fun to see and just empower families to know that they are their child's first teacher. And so this time period has been amazing because for me, philosophically, I truly believe that. And now it's on display. And I give a big hand to all the parents out there who are at home up their rightful space and their rightful role of being their child's teacher. And I've been really proud of my friends who are doing it, my parents back in Shanghai who are doing it. And it's just really amazing to see how everyone's stepping up. So.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's and a lot of what I hear from parents that I know is that it's really hard. It is really hard, and there's almost this feeling of failure at some point. How are we really doing? How can we really do all of this? And this true sense of overwhelm, and also for some teachers as well, particularly teachers that have their own children or focusing on homeschooling their children, but they're also really focused and completely dedicated to their 30 children in the classroom. And so it's really finding this balance of how can we really support all of everyone, but really also how can people feel good about the work that they're doing every day without feeling like they're not accomplishing what they should be accomplishing. And so it's interesting, but it's sad, but I feel like it's also part of this larger dynamic of what we're going through. And I think that teachers this isn't isolated to teachers that are in a certain grade level or at a certain part of the country or working with a certain group of students. I mean, it's pretty much nearly every teacher I talk to.
For sure. And I think one thing that I think is missing from the conversation often is just naming the fact that this is an emergency. Even though we can't see this virus, even though it's something that's moving and we're watching it on TV, but then we can unplug and, it's something where we're like, well, I can still go outside. I can still engage in my home. This is an emergency situation. So everything that happens from now until the time things open back up, we're just trying to survive, right? And so in a lot of ways, we have to take it easy. We have to be easy. We have to be okay with the fact that it's not going to be what we planned, which is our children in schools.
Mm-hmm.
And we've never been in a situation like this before. Let's say there was a snow day, and let's say teachers are lucky you get 2 snow days. A few days off of school, that's one thing. But to have months off of school is a completely different thing. So we're all scrambling, but in a lot of ways, people are really stepping up. And so naming that helps me at least to get pressure off of myself. I know when things first happened, I got into the craft personally because I love being around children. Like, that's why I teach kindergarten. Mm-hmm. And I think for a lot of us, we were just like, this distance learning thing, I don't want to do this. Like, this is not what I want to do. And so we're in our 12th week now of distance learning. And so it took 2 or 3 weeks to realize, like, oh, this is my new normal. So let's try to find a way to create as much as possible something that supports you at home. It's not like I'm there, but how can we support each other? Because again, this is an emergency. So I always like to say that first. It helps me to kind of guide the way that I approach distance learning. And it's helped me to kind of settle into a nice routine with my students who I'll teach tonight at 9, p.m.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty amazing. It's still hard to believe that you're actually going to work right after this, but I see Julia has joined us. Hello, Julia. Thank you for joining. And I see you have some comments as well. Yes. So this is a totally different experience if you have young children. Yours are 12 and 15, yes. And so independence, but if you have kids 2 to 10, you're on duty. And if you have a job, that's super challenging. Yes. And that's exactly it. That's exactly what I'm finding. And it is super challenging. And so one of the commitments that I made, actually, to your point, Julia, is that this webinar is being recorded. And there are people that have said that they actually want to share this webinar with people in their communities, parents that they know. And I was talking to someone in Montana who wants to share it with the children's group that she works with there, because people are just so overwhelmed. And so it is super challenging to think about how do you manage all this, particularly if you have two or three, in some cases, children under 10. How do you manage this? But at the end of the day, this is your priority. It's what you're committed to. But when you're thinking about how can you take one call, but then make sure that, one child that you're helping them to get on Zoom, another child is done with their work. So you're just saying, hey, go ahead and start gaming, whatever that happens to be, really trying to manage all that. Right. And so I think this is kind of a good transition to kind of getting into one of the, first questions for tonight, is that at the end of the day, one of the things that I continue to hear is that people don't want their children to fall behind. There's a lawyer that I was emailing with over the weekend, and she's like, oh, thank you so much for doing this. This is such a challenge. She's someone who has 2 children, I believe under 5. And so her perspective is just, she's just like a lot of people feeling overwhelmed. And so what should they be doing, or what, from your perspective, as you work with children of this age, how can parents best engage children, but also really help them to also feel empowered at the same time, and also maybe like they have a little bit more of control over how their children are learning during this time, particularly since in many cases, school ends early, or classes just aren't really the same as they used to be.
So I think when we work with families in Shanghai, a lot of our work is around families understanding what is developmentally appropriate. It's one of those things where, again, in my space is young children. I've taught pre-K. I had a group of kindergarten boys for a few years that I taught, which was really interesting when you're watching young kids like run all over the place and you're like, what's wrong with you? And when you do more research, there is nothing wrong with them. That is where they are developmentally. And so starting at where the children are developmentally and understanding what that looks like, it's very helpful for a family and for parents to kind of see what the learning should also look like. I am a play advocate. I'm a early childhood play advocate. I love play. Play has become a really dirty word in education, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I'm going to stand firm on the fact that I believe young children, I can't speak to the older, but young children should be playing. And
Mhm.
so it is not out of the realm of development that if you sit a child down with a workbook, they're not going to do it for extended periods of time. It isn't because they have focusing issues. It isn't because they don't enjoy learning. It is because they should be engaging in the building of blocks, or they should be tampering with sensory objects and just playing and engaging with the world around them in your home or in your backyard or wherever that might be. Unfortunately, when it comes to schooling, when we look at school and education, it looks a certain way. It looks like children at a table, looking at whether it be a screen or looking at a book and being focused and quiet.
Mhm.
Nothing about my kindergarten classroom is ever quiet until we're doing some quiet reading.
Uh,
Because I'm focused on making sure that my classroom, in my classroom, my kindergartners are engaging in things that are developmentally appropriate. It should be messy in your home right now. It should be really loud in your home right now. Um, that is what it should be, and so that is where I would start. Right? I always pull this out. This is like my Bible.
Yardsticks.
And just like, this is one of the many resources. I mean, the great thing here, which is different in China, you can get on Google and just type things in and find out more about your child, whether they're 3 years old or whether they're 8 years old, and just really understand more around early childhood development and what it looks like.
Mhm.
Then really thinking about like, what is your long-term vision? We always like ask parents when we work with them, think about 30 years down the line, where you want your child to kind of go in life and what you want them to be, and kind of planning from there. And that means you've selected maybe a private school, maybe a bilingual school, maybe a traditional, public school in your area. Like, it doesn't matter what kind of school you're in, but knowing the long-term kind of like approach when it comes to the scope and sequence of their curriculum. Because
Mhm.
now, as we engage with parents, we have to engage with them like they're first year teachers. I was
Mm.
a first year teacher. I
Thanks.
didn't know what I was doing. I read a bunch of books. I wrote wrote a long paper. I engaged with students for a bit of time. But when you have your own classroom,
Mhm.
a lot of young parents are doing for the first time, where they're creating a classroom in their home. You really have to think about like, okay, what are the standards? What are the things that my child has to know? What do these children have to know? How do I try different methods to get them to learn it? And then I assess it, not
Mhm.
score. Like, we could care less about if you get an A or a B, or if you pass the test, or if it's standardized and all the data. Good teaching is all about taking the assessment, taking the learning that your children have, and then reteaching. And right now you have an opportunity to go online, whether it be Common Core or whatever standards you're using, understanding what your child should know this year. Because for the most part, I'm going to be honest with you, I've never had a challenge singing, the ABC song, right? Like, teaching, you're not your children aren't 16 taking or 17 taking an IB physics test. This,
Right.
3 times 3, right? And for sure, it's frustrating. It takes a lot of patience, and you have to approach it a certain way. But when you're a first year teacher, it's all about that process of understanding what they need to know. And so,
Yeah.
if you are a parent right now, make sure you know what that is, and make sure you hold the school accountable, or make sure you do your research online to find out in your system or in your school, by the end of the year this year, what was my child supposed to know, and how do I now fill in those gaps? And there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. So
Mhm. Yeah, interesting. I was actually reading an article the other day, and there was a woman. She's well known as a well known platform, but she wasn't familiar to me. And but she mentioned that she took her first grade out of school, like completely out of school. And it was this big controversy about it. And people were saying, oh, you're not, why are you, shaming the school in this way? And why can't you just kind of go with the flow? And she was like, hey, you know what? This is not happening. Like, she was just not confident or comfortable with what was happening and how they were engaging with children. So she completely took her first grader out of school. And so I don't know exactly what that means for the first grader come the fall, but I just thought that was really fascinating. And I also thought that was a pretty bold move, but I thought that's an example of a parent who's, taking full accountability of their child's education at this moment. And so I thought that was interesting.
Well, I think that's one thing I learned more than anything else teaching in Shanghai was the fact that my families, I knew for sure that they trusted me, but they never trusted my school completely when it came to the education of their child, like ever. And in a lot of ways, we would gloat as teachers because we would say, oh man, our scores are so high, the kids are so sharp. But I would always talk about the fact that we were working on it with a team of tutors from around the world and people in the afternoons that were working with children. So I would do a lot of stuff in the classroom and I would come back the next day and they would just know it. And I would be like, oh, I must have killed that lesson yesterday. But over time, when you develop relationships with these parents, they have the same exact perspective. I didn't necessarily trust your school alone for the education of my child. So, okay, school is over now. Great. We're going to continue to do what we were doing anyway, to learn math, to learn language, to learn science, to engage in the world, because it is the family's responsibility to do so. And in a lot of ways, the power structures change, right? I always talk about the fact that as educators, we're here to serve, we're here to serve families. And it isn't necessarily the other way around. And it's unfortunate right now, as I engage with some families in the States, it is a passive approach in a way. They're doing the best that they can, but for the first time, some of them are saying, wait a minute, like, I've just been dropping my child off at this school, and I definitely know what they're learning, but for sure, whether it be me or the school and the parent education, like, I don't know what to do if they're not here. And hopefully this is a wake-up call. I'm really excited about it. Like, hopefully this is a wake-up call where after this, no one ever has these moments, and we always take on this role as partners, as co-teachers, because that's what we do. Definitely feel her, and I don't shame her. I think that is what this should be all about. And all families should feel that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. And you mentioned first-time teachers. So if you're in the education system and you're a first-year teacher, I was talking to a teacher yesterday, and she's in California, and she was just emailing me. So I was actually just emailing her back as you were talking. So if you saw me focusing on the computer, that was why, because she's like, oh, I want to be on. So, but she didn't register. So I was helping her to get connected so she could get on. But she's just this incredibly bright light, just, incredible teacher. And she was saying just how if you're in the first to 5 years of teaching, just how challenging it is right now. And it doesn't matter what grade you're teaching, right? Just if you're in your first 5 years of teaching right now, you can be in high school, doesn't matter what school you're in, you can be private school, public school, it's just such a hard time. And that the mindset right now, Julie is a mindset expert actually with us today, and the mindset of some of these teachers have been really challenging. Right. And so one of the things she's passionate about is helping some of the teachers to really kind of move past this because she can see how it's impacting the children. And one of the things she's super proud of, and she works with inner city youth, and she lives in San Diego, and that's where her school district is. And so she's working basically with all Latinos and Latinas. And so for her, she said that she is most proud of the fact that her students have had 100% attendance since this has happened. And I'm like, that's incredible. I mean, that's like basically unheard of to have 100% attendance. And so it just says a lot about how she is truly engaging children. And I think that says a lot. So, and she's teaching more high school, so it's a different age range, but I just thought it was really such a powerful story. So I see a quote from Julia, or a message from Julia. Do you think we are doing enough about the digital divide right now? There are millions of kids who don't have devices at home. What do you know about what is being done to make sure children have access? Yes, great question. And I'm so glad that you asked that. So, Terris, how about you go ahead and answer that first, and then I'll go after you. Yeah.
Well, again, I've been in Shanghai for the last 5 years, and I'm from the Baltimore area. I'm a preacher's kid. And in a lot of ways, you mentioned earlier some of my vision around like the fact that there is this massive divide. And you know, when I arrived here in February, Super Bowl Sunday, the first thing my dad and I were talking about, I was like, Dad, I don't know what's about to happen here in this country, but for sure, we need to be thinking about how we can engage with just thinking about distance learning. Because I knew I had to do it. And I'm like, this is something that if this pandemic hits Baltimore City, I was thinking about certain people that I know and my church members and my community members. And I'm like, I just don't see how we're going to be able to provide children with instruction. Now, I don't want to talk about systems. I don't want to rag anyone, but I do know that different schools, even in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, private schools, different schools are not created equal, right? So some schools are going out of their way to get children supplies. You've heard different stories of people trying to get supplies to kids, but it's not really working out. Or you get the supplies to the children, but how you know you're going to get them back? And just because you have an iPad and internet at your home doesn't mean you're going to click the Zoom screen. So a lot of about like certain amount of responsibility on the other end, but for sure, there's a massive divide. And it isn't just about the devices, but it's really about the access to the internet. And right now, I think school systems, government systems around the world have to really make up their mind around how we want to engage with this population of people who need education more now than ever, and if it's worth the investment. And this is, for me as an aspiring, like someone who would love to be able to create policy around a lot of this stuff, I think, we really need to be thinking about our most vulnerable population, which are the youngest students. And right now, I know for sure, I wish there could be more that's done, but I know in Baltimore City, there's, massive deficit when it comes to money. And I don't know if they have the resources. And so I know I've been in deep conversations with people who are philanthropists. And, you just want to throw money at this thing. So like, get the kids the devices, get the kids the internet. But then from there, it's like, okay, if you have all, is that it? What is the next step from there, right? Quality instruction, from what I've seen in my 12 of distance learning, you really have to have a teacher who understands and is connected to the children in a way where they can really engage with them. Especially when it comes to young children, and engage with them in a way where the learning is still happening. I think there for sure can be a lot more done. And I think right now, the great thing is everyone's kind of chatting about it and talking about it. And what I'm hoping is we get some systems in place where more children can get access to some of the engagements that I know I'm having with children throughout the night here in Baltimore. And we're having a lot of fun, and we're reading books, and we're doing guided reading groups, math talks, and a lot of it's happening because they have resources, they have internet, and across the board, before coronavirus, there was a deficit in education. It will continue to be a deficit, and we will continue to need people like the people on this line who are doing this great work around the country and just fighting that. But this is an interesting time where there's a flashlight on all the inequities that we just don't pay attention to. And so I hope it just sparks some attention to it.
Yeah, no, definitely. So we had two comments that came through, so I just wanted to give voice to that. One, Zoe asked a question about an organization that she and I are both familiar with called World Pulse, and they do a lot about really bridging the digital divide, particularly internationally, but of women. So how do we get more women online to ensure that they have the tools that they need to just be able to even work and take care of their children, but also for education, so just digital literacy overall. But also to help ensure that women actually have access to resources that they need to be able to help solve their own problems in their communities. We have a lot of really amazing large nonprofits and small nonprofits that are doing a lot of amazing work, but that work is not actually solving the problems that these women can actually solve in their community. And that is just the reality in many cases. And so it's an incredible organization doing lots of work. So I think that's a great point, Zoe. And then Julia, thank us for having this conversation. I mean, Julia, it's amazing because, you and I both live here in the New York area. And I was talking to a couple of administrators for the Department of Education here a couple weeks ago. And one of the biggest things that did come up was during that time, which was really truly in the heat of everything that was going on, was the fact that at this point, the Department of Education was trying to get devices out to students that they knew didn't have devices at home, just so that they can continue the education. But then the problem was that once the devices got to the home, let's say the home has 4 children in it. Okay, so then how do you decide which child gets the device at what time and when, and how do you divide all of that up? And so then it just became this, even it just kind of made broader this issue around the lack of access to devices and tools. And from what I understand, the internet providers here in the state of New York, or at least in the New York City area, are supposed to be making the internet free for students or individuals that don't have access to the internet, because it is seen as a basic human need right now. But the challenge is that a lot of us are experiencing slow internet. But again, it doesn't matter if you have the internet if you don't have the device to connect. So just a lot of challenges overall there. But even, to the point that you were speaking about, Terris, as well, I mean, one of the reasons why I'm also very passionate about this, and we haven't even talked that much yet about some of the security aspects of this, but for me, I truly see this as a national security issue for the United States. We do know that we have the census going on this year in 2020. We do know that in 2040, the people of color in this country will be the majority of people that will be active providers in this economy. And so that we need to actively ensure right now that students are part of an education system that in 20 years from now can make them very active people in our physical economy and our financial economy, so that we don't have a drop in gross domestic product, and that we remain viable and really being able to just be, we could say a lot of things, negative things about the United States, but it's also kind of nice to continue to be in a position of influence within the world. And so these types of things are important. And so this is a long game, but it starts with education. And this is a national security issue, because then it becomes, right now, it's an education security issue, which becomes an economic security issue, which becomes a national security issue.
And to that point, I just wanted to mention this, right? Again, I want to stay in my lane here.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. I'm so glad that you jumped on. So thank you for adding such valuable insight to the conversation tonight. Thank you.
I want to stay in my lane of just thinking about early childhood and the importance right now of parent education, instead of us focusing so much on getting, devices in kids' hands so that they're learning, right? Because in the scheme of things right now, if we are depending on a device and a teacher to kind of like spoon feed children a lot of the content that they need, it means that I don't think, especially with children at a young age, we're not thinking about what is developmentally appropriate when it comes to their learning, right? So in a lot of schools, and we've talked a lot about this in education, children are arriving to school, 5 and 6-year-old kids, and they're doing math and literacy all day, right? They're learning how to read and how to write and how to, add and subtract all day long, limited recess. And that is our vision right now of school. And in a lot of ways, trying to then create that at your home, I would challenge someone I would say, like, it is going to be borderline impossible to go 6 hours during the day and just force your child to do that. First of all, it's really challenging to do it in a school setting as well. And so right now, I think our focus needs to be more on experiential learning, right? On project-based learning, on place-based learning, on a lot of the things that we can do around learning and things that connect for sure to these skills needed, to your point, for children to go out into the world and be successful, whether it be these soft skills and things of that nature. But when you are cooking that meal as a family, there's a lot of math involved. You can do a lot of notes and taking notes and doing writing, but making the learning authentic and connecting it to what's actually happening in your home. We have to start our mindset when it comes to learning and schooling and education. And once this happens, I think it will liberate my people, right? Right now, I'm really passionate as I come back to Baltimore to really speak to my people here, who look at schooling a certain way, and just liberate them to understand that if they have a young child, it isn't necessarily right now about all of the societal pressures around these scores and getting kids ready for next year. Readiness right now in our world is being able to adapt and do what developmentally are supposed to be able to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you want to, if you're a parent and you watch this, if you want to have your child tomorrow spend hours alone, set up their favorite play area and let them go.
Mm-hmm.
I know from experience, if you give them that opportunity to play and engage, there are ways that you can thoughtfully embed a lot of these learning standards into their play. And it will become a flow that will also change the environment in your home. I know right
Mm-hmm.
now, I can only imagine being a child in my home. I have a very traditional family. This is back in the day where you can give kids, spankings back in the day. I'm a grown up now, so it's
Yeah.
time. But if you want to have an environment where socially and emotionally everyone's in a good space, and I know in my classroom I'm really passionate about that. Let the children have the time to play and engage, and it helps them to calm down. But also, that is right now on the younger end of things. That should be their work, because whatever happens next year around the proficiency and the scores and the whole nine. If you're also sending back to school a really anxious child,
Mm. Yeah.
it's not the way to go. And I have to advocate for that because that is what's most important when you're dealing in an emergency.
Mm-hmm. Yep. No, I definitely. And I think, I know that there's been talk too that there have been children who that have had a tough time because they do have questions and they don't understand what's going on. And of course, some of this could be also be fed up on their parents, or they can be learning this from their parents. But I've heard that a lot of children are having a tough time. And part of the reason why there were kind of this Zoom bombing that was taking place is that children needed a way to act out, so if there was a way that they could just kind of act out and not just be sitting there like they're in class, but do something and be disruptive. And that it's just a way of trying to, of really just of acting out and trying to make sense of everything that's going on. And it's something that, and depending on what your experience is, depending on what information that you have, this just doesn't make sense. And it is scary. And so it's interesting to see that from different ages as well. It's really just quite fascinating. But let's go ahead and switch gears to how can we really focus on creating safe spaces online and offline? And I know that I can talk a bit about offline security, but I'd love for you to just share your thoughts on how do we create these physical spaces that really are conducive for learning.
Okay. So again, I think maybe the best way to approach it is, again, going about it, looking at that first year teacher who's entering a classroom for the first time and there's furniture everywhere and you're trying to figure out how do you set up this classroom so you can engage with 30 students. But right now you have your two children in your home and you're wondering to yourself, okay, I don't want my family to go off into their rooms all day, but you need to create a space where your family can be that is open in a lot of ways, and that is conducive to the learning that is happening. And so the first thing that I do, and I know this is so silly, and every year people laugh at me when I do it, but I always walk around my learning space in my classroom on my knees. I'm 6'1", and a lot of times you look down on their learning environment, right? So I'm used to my knees being near my ears when I'm sitting down in my classroom because you're sitting down in these really, really small chairs. But it's very important to see the learning space from their point of view. Because a lot of times when we hang pictures or we put up, learning materials on walls, we're looking at it from our point of view. And so we really need to kind of go down and kind of look at it from their space. And now that your child isn't just home for dinner, family time and sleep, and they're there all day long for months at a time, you need to think first and foremost about the safety in your space. Are there a lot of sharp corners? Can your 5-year-old boy run from one side of the room to the other side? This is what I think about all the time. Because regardless of how much, I might tell a child, no running in class, they are going to run. And have I created, and I call them lanes of learning, in my in these spaces where children can kind of get from one place to another? Have you created environments where they can get to different materials that they might need throughout the day, right? That are on their level. And so the first thing is like putting yourself at their point of view. I think another thing to think about right now is if you are a parent that's working throughout the day and you cannot engage with your child all day long, but you also need to be able to see them, but also interact with people at your job, whether it be, on a Zoom call or you're on email, you need to find a space in your home. And it's usually like your living room area. And I'm usually working with families in Shanghai that are living in really small apartment spaces. And, we have done some sessions with families and some just interactions and we've had conversations with families around how do they then change their spaces to make sure that their child has an area in the space. I think a lot of parents are passionate about like being able to have their home still be their home, right? So you don't want the toys and the stuff all over the place, but right now it's very important to find a little nook. And I know for me as a kindergarten teacher, young children love nooks. They love spaces where they can kind of crawl into and read a book with a flashlight. Kids love making little forts. And they love spaces that can kind of linger on for longer periods of time. So right now is a great time to say, okay, let me move this piece of furniture out of the way, or let me use this piece of furniture and put something over it and create this space where you can go and engage in whatever that might be. These spaces also need to be spaces that can get really dirty, spaces that can be used and they're modular. You can move things out of the way. But again, like making sure you are at a position to kind of see your child at all times to make sure that they're safe. And I think that's a great place to start in your home, whether you're in a mansion or if you're in a small apartment in New York. They can be anywhere. So I think that's very important because right now we have to keep an eye on the children for a lot of different reasons, right? And so I've been doing a lot of Skype calls with children in the mornings. And a lot of parents like to kind of like sit over the shoulder and look at the screen, but some families like to have their children on the screen and kind of leave the room. And I remember like it was yesterday, I was talking to a mom and we were talking about supplemental education. We said, yeah, I have this great English tutor who comes to my home and he comes into he goes to my son's room and they have a session for an hour. And I'm looking at her like, wait a minute, like you let a grown man go to your son's room. Where are you? And she's like, well, I'm downstairs and I'm cooking and I'm like, you never do that again, ever. And it was a serious moment too, because, I was teaching her a child and, we knew each other.
Yeah.
She was a little afraid. Like, she's like, oh my God, did I do something wrong? And I'm like, yes, this is okay. Because our job as adults has to be to make sure that the children are safe. So same thing. If your child is in a room and they are on a screen with an adult, there either needs to be a recording like what we're doing right now, and they need to send that recording to you afterwards, or that person needs to be on the line. Like, for example, my sessions, I do them at 9 p.m. every night. My kids 9 a.m. in Shanghai. My assistant is on the line with me. So there's 2 adults there, right? You want to make sure the children are safe because seriously, you got to think about the people who are closest to your children. And you need to you're safeguarding your child from all adults at all times. And so they can really advocate for themselves. And this is something we have to take serious because then all of a sudden something happens and you think to yourself, oh my goodness, like, why would I allow my child to do that? And you just don't want that kind of stuff to happen. So I'm constantly having conversations with families. And I'm like, I want you to look at me like I'm a predator as well. Make sure you are holding me to the fire and make sure the child is safe. This is the most important thing. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, it happens. We're all digital. We're all.
That's something I'm very passionate about right now because usually when it comes to our youngest students, they are the last ones that we think about a lot of times when it comes to this kind of stuff. And then when it happens, we wonder why it was happening in the beginning. Why were we sending our child to, again, their rooms with a complete stranger to do English lessons for an hour a day? And then you why, as an adult, your child is telling you that they were, they were mistreated as a young child by an adult who was a predator, who was a predator. So
Mm-hmm.
have to have these conversations now. That's why I really appreciate the fact that we're having this conversation now.
Yeah, no, these are such great points, and thank you for saying that. And I think that's just such a great segue to, because this is, I think it's so powerful to also hear you as a teacher saying this and saying, hold me accountable, and because, these are things a lot of people don't think about. I can definitely say that. Now, I don't have children, so I can honestly say I have not thought about it. But it's great to hear you say that, because now I definitely will make sure it's, it's an active part of my consciousness, going forward. But I think that there is sometimes this inherent trust that we just say, hey, yeah, you're here to teach, I don't know, my child an instrument or English or whatever it is. Okay, go ahead. And we don't always pause and ensure that the proper safety and security measures are taken for children. Yeah.
And I was on the child protection committee at Shanghai American School for a few years. And it was very interesting seeing how different schools approach child protection at their schools. And I'm a drummer. So I would do a lot of drum lessons with students. And once you build this relationship, you also have to understand, like, that is a part of what people do to abuse your child, right? They court them, and you hear these stories where it's like, we thought he was a great guy. I had my child around him for years. And then all of a sudden you find out that this was happening. And so think about all the major cases of just like child abuse in our country. There are these pillars in communities where everyone's like, that's a great guy. And of course, I'll send my kid over to their home to spend, or to their, they play basketball, and like I would send them there. And the intent of it, I think sometimes as educators, like, oh, the parents just want a babysitter. No, like, you want to believe that you live in a world where people about your child, right? Like, you don't want to live in a world where you have to, kind of like worry about everyone when it comes to your child. However, the great thing with technology is it buffers that, right? It's like, no, there is a camera here. And I had a big thing in my class, and I would talk about it often. Like, I have nothing to hide. Like, put a camera on me at all times, just like a police officer. Like, I would love a body cam, like there's a time when I'm around the child, you don't know what I'm doing with them. What am I doing that I need to hide, where I need to shut my door and you can't see what we're doing inside of this class? And I have, 20 or 30, 5-year-olds who might not even know how to express to their family what happened on a Zoom call. And I don't want to scare people or to bring anxiety, but these are the kinds of questions that we need to ask, because you would never just send your child off solo with a teacher during, you just wouldn't do that one-on-one.
Right.
That's practice.
Yeah. No, really, really great points and powerful. And also thanks for sharing your experience about being on the Child Protection Committee, because that really just speaks volumes, I think. And really, I can imagine, really opened your eyes up to what happens and how it happens specifically. And I think that's an interesting point, because one of the key things you said was communication, and really talk to your children, have the lines of communication open. And I think really for young children, communication is really the way to also talk about online dangers as well. Because particularly, now it's like, okay, children are having devices put in front of them. But other than that, they wouldn't have, devices put in front of them unless it was the parent giving it to them for the most part. And there may not have been this focus on maybe taking it, having to do education online. So it maybe just would have been, playing some sort of game or something like that. But now it is a little bit different. And so when you're talking about young children, it's, they're not necessarily going to be on social media, most likely. And so it should be pretty finite in terms of what interactions are that are taking place online. But there should be some sort of dialogue that helps them to know what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. So kind of what your point of, I remember someone saying to someone, that they were at a family gathering, and someone said, "Oh, go hug Uncle whatever," and the person said, "No, if my child doesn't want to hug Uncle, Bob, let's say, then my child is not going to go hug Uncle Bob, right? Like if my child doesn't feel comfortable doing it, they're not going to do it." And I think it's having that type of understanding too about children when they're online. And so whether it's verbal cues, nonverbal cues, whatever it is that you're picking up about how they're interacting online with someone, Is there something that gives you an indication that they don't feel comfortable? And I think that, and then asking, and then also to letting them know what they should be aware of and what's okay and what's not okay, are things that at that age are really important to do. Now, as children get older, parents have parental controls. So of course you can implement that, whether it's TV or their phones, and their gaming devices, all of that can happen, of course. And there are many different types of apps that parents can use to monitor their children, whether it's monitoring email, monitoring texting, GPS, put a GPS on your child's phone. But again, we're getting to a certain age of children when we're doing that. So we're talking probably, I don't know, maybe a 13-year-old. I know a lot of 10-year-olds that have phones as well, particularly in the urban areas, so that their parents can track them after school. But that too is part of a conversation of why this is happening, and kind of, it's not about the fact that you don't trust them, but it's about you want to protect them because it's other people you may not trust. And I remember I was talking to a father in Texas, and he was explaining to me the conversation he had with his son about why he put a GPS tracking and parental controls on his son's phone, and his son was so upset about it. And he said he really had to explain it to him, and really explain it to him in a way that he understood that this was about love and this was about protection, and that it wasn't about not trusting him, but it was just about helping to really ensure that he was safe. And I think it's having those kind of conversations that are just so important as well, and really just, continuing to educate children, because I think that so many children, even when it comes to online dangers, whether it's on social media or it's really anything. A lot of times the red flag just doesn't come up. And I think a lot of dangers happen that way. But in addition to that, I know we talked a little bit before about Zoom and that being a concern. There are lots of other social media platforms and kind of social gathering platforms that people are using, and helping young people to understand what is best on those platforms is always a really important thing to do. And also understanding who's on these platforms. Are they hanging out with their friends? Are they hanging out with family? Are they hanging out with their kind of either girlfriend, quote unquote, boyfriend, whatever it is? And what are they doing on these platforms? And having a better understanding of how these are being used, I think, is also really important. And if a platform is geared towards youth, so for, let's say, teenagers, for example, a good red flag for them is to be mindful of someone that they don't know that they're interacting with, because how can they validate that person is not an adult or not a teenager, or that they're not who they say they are. And so that's a really important thing too, that I know has come up for young people that are really kind of emerging more to engaging with people online. And so I think it's interesting, and I feel like there's so much on this topic, and I think it goes back to the point made at the beginning, that as we kind of, talk about these online challenges that come up where, one, it's the communication, but if you use parental controls and use that in combination with communication, two, monitoring the online platforms that children are using of all ages, just being that partner and engaged parent to your child. And three, that whatever tools that they have to use for school, you don't have to sacrifice privacy and security for them to use this tool. And if the school can't tell you or give you a tool that they can use that is secure and that has right privacy controls, then either maybe they don't use that tool in order to complete the project, or maybe it's just finding another platform to use that's separate from the school project, or they just find maybe do it in a more manual way if that's possible. But you don't have to give up privacy and security in order to do this. And I think that this is going to be an ongoing challenge for school districts and administrators going forward, is to really have someone dedicated to ensuring that they're really having that they are choosing the right applications for children to use, so that it's easy for parents to be able to set up for their children.
Too, I mean, there definitely needs to be positions at schools, but again, from different perspectives, right? If you're at a K-12 school, what child protection looks like for a 5-year-old is a lot different when it comes to a 13-year-old, right?
Exactly.
That's all about knowing, and as we started, developmentally where they are. And even more so than that, like, that is our job. And that's why I really admire what you're doing as adults. It is our job to protect the children, And we have to take on that and understand that it might mean that they're not having as much fun. It might
Yeah.
mean that, like it's because we have a low jack on their phone, right? But that is our job, and it isn't
Yeah.
necessarily liking us all the time, but it's about them being safe. And I know, in my classroom, and I got this from my mentor, Linda Butler, like, be safe, be kind, right? And that's it. You want to see Mr. King get super upset if you're not kind and you're not safe. But that safe piece, that's my role. When people send me their children, I'm very passionate about trying to get them back the same child they sent. Sometimes things happen, or they make mistakes, they might hurt themselves, but that's the care, especially when you're dealing with young children. It's about us making sure that they're safe. And so we have to keep that, again, in the forefront of our minds during this type of emergency where we're making a lot of decisions because, it's like last minute and we're like frantically like, oh, get on the screen and then do this. We have to take a moment and really think about how we're going to keep the children safe.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Wow, we've covered so much on this call, and it's hard to believe it's already 8 o'clock. I feel like there's so much more that we could discuss. I mean, I think that's the amazing thing about this topic is that we've had to do this second webinar is because there's really so much to really dig into, particularly when you start to really dig down to the different age groups and you really start to go, okay, let's really make sure we're tailoring security and safety to different age groups to ensure that they really have what they need and also that they have the right learning spaces to thrive as well. So as we wrap up, I just want to ask you, is there any last minute thoughts that you would like to share with people that are watching and people that will probably be watching in the future? I mean, this is a video that will be open and active, and I know a lot of parent communities and teachers communities have really expressed interest in watching this. And I think that there's, it's interesting to because at the time of this recording, we're at the, end of April, beginning of May. And we're really in the heat of the pandemic, and it's we don't really know what the fall is going to look like. It's still up in the air, but things do seem to be moving still very quickly. But I'm curious to know what thoughts you would like to leave with the audience today.
Well, I think for us at Home to School, we are really passionate about empowering families. And whenever I go through trauma in my life, I always try to look for silver linings and the things that I can learn and the opportunity. Right now in our world, there's a huge opportunity. And it's an opportunity for parents it's an awakening to understand that, wait a minute, I need to be in control of this process. I have a child and their educational journey is what I need to be taking on and thinking about, whether school is in session or not. And so now we need to be thinking more around like not schooling, but about learning and education. And if we can really get down to what the difference between those two things and how we engage in our world, I believe that this awakening is going to change the world and the way that we engage with learning. I'm super excited for it as someone who is really passionate about parents and parent education and what happens when parents are in the driver's seat. Because it holds me to the fire, it holds schools to this fire, it holds school systems to the fire. And so I just want to send a lot of love out there to all my teacher friends slash parents. Because I know for me, I have 15 families in Shanghai right now that are rock stars, and they are doing things that they thought they could never do, and they've stepped up to the plate. And so for every family out there right now, trust me, in my 12th week of distance learning, weeks from now, it's going to get better. And it might be more. We have to, because we can do it together and we can work together. So I just want to send that love out there to family educators around the world. Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me again. It means a lot.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experiences. It's really been incredible. I also just want to thank Zoe. Thank you so much for being with us as always. And thank you for your questions and for helping us to monitor and really modulate this conversation, and also giving voice to World Pulse, because World Pulse really is an incredible organization that connects women worldwide for change. And they are incredible with connecting women in, let's say, Zimbabwe, to women in the Philippines, to women in Afghanistan to really share ideas on how they can really help with different challenges they have in their community, whether it's education, environment, focusing on various aspects of violence, education for their own children, not just for themselves, but for their own children. And it's really, and this is such a powerful time, and a lot of women are using this platform to not only share their stories, but they're also using this platform to be able to really help think about education in a different way, because they've been doing this. This platform has been around for nearly 13 years now. And we will actually have Yancina on at a future time. She's going to be doing an interview with us in May, so we'll be able to talk more about that. But for everyone, thank you so much for joining us. This was such a wonderful conversation, and who knows, we may have a Consciously Secure Parent 3. I feel like there's still just so much left to be said on this topic. But thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening. Bye.